The AirPods connected before I even knew Leah was home. I was hunched over my workbench in the garage, trying to fix Mrs. Henderson's ancient outboard motor for the third time this month, when that familiar chime echoed through the tiny speakers. The Bluetooth had picked up her phone automatically, something that happened whenever she pulled into our driveway. Usually I'd disconnect immediately, privacy and all that. But tonight, something in her voice made me pause. I know, she was saying, her tone softer than it had been with me in months. But we have to be careful about this. I set down my wrench and frowned. Leah never talked like that, vulnerable, almost pleading. In our 15 years of marriage, I'd learned to read every inflection in her voice. This wasn't the crisp, professional tone she used for work calls, or the clipped efficiency she'd adopted with me lately. This was intimate. My finger hovered over the disconnect button on my phone, but curiosity won. Just for a minute, I told myself, just to understand who could make my wife sound so human. Brooks doesn't suspect anything, she continued. He's too busy with those stupid boat engines to notice what's happening right under his nose. The wrench slipped from my other hand and clattered onto the concrete floor. She was talking about me. I've been laying the groundwork for months, Leah said. The separate accounts, the property transfers. He signed everything without even reading it. God, he's so trusting it's almost pathetic. My chest tightened. I thought about all those documents she'd brought home recently, insurance updates she'd called them, boring paperwork that I'd signed while watching the evening news, grateful that she handled the complicated stuff. The timing has to be perfect, the voice on the other end replied, and my entire world shifted. I knew that voice. It was deeper than I remembered, weathered by years I hadn't been there to witness, but unmistakable. The same voice that had taught me to tie fishing knots, that had read me bedtime stories about pirates and treasure hunters. It was my father's voice, but that was impossible. Dad had been gone for 3 years now. I'd held his hand in that sterile hospital room, watched the monitors flatline, sat through the funeral where half the town showed up to pay their respects to the man who'd built Carvin Marine from nothing. Brooks still thinks you left him the boatyard outright, Leah was saying. He has no idea about the conditions in the will. The boy always was too sentimental, came the response in my father's voice. Just like his mother, never could see the bigger picture. I sank onto my work stool, the garage spinning slightly around me. This had to be some kind of recording. Maybe Leah was listening to old voicemails, though I couldn't imagine why she'd be discussing our finances with a recording of my father. The debt consolidation papers go through next week, Leah continued. Once those are filed, the house and the business will be underwater. He'll have to sell to cover the loans. And you'll be there with a buyer lined up, my father's voice said with what sounded like approval. Smart girl. I always knew you understood the value of long-term planning. My hands started shaking. I gripped the edge of the workbench, trying to process what I was hearing. Debt consolidation? We didn't have any significant debt. Our mortgage was manageable, and the business was finally turning a decent profit after years of struggling. Evan's been very patient, Leah said, but he's ready to move forward with the development plans as soon as we clear the title. Evan. I knew that name. Evan Porter, the slick business consultant who'd been sniffing around the waterfront properties for the past year, making offers that seemed too good to be true. Leah had mentioned him a few times, always dismissively. Just another city boy who thinks he can turn our town into the Hamptons, she'd said. Apparently, she'd been more interested in his plans than she'd let on. The marina project will triple the property value, my father's voice continued. Brooks will never have to worry about money again, once he gets over the initial shock. You really think he'll see it that way? Leah asked. He's got his mother's soft heart, but he's not stupid. Once he realizes he can't save the business anyway, he'll be grateful for the buyout. I wanted to rip the AirPods out of my ears, to storm into the house and demand an explanation, but something kept me frozen in place. listening to my wife and my apparently not deceased father discuss my future like I was a child who couldn't handle adult decisions. "What about the other properties?" Leah asked. "The rental houses on Maple Street?" "Those go into the development package, too. Evan's investors want the whole waterfront corridor." I knew those houses. Dad had bought them one by one over the years, fixing them up and renting them to young families just starting out. He'd always said they were his contribution to keeping the town alive, making sure people could afford to live here even as property values rose. "Brooks thinks he inherited them free and clear," Leah said, "because that's what he needed to think. The boy's got too much of his mother's bleeding heart. If he'd known about the leverage requirements, he would have tried to find some way to keep everything together. Would have worked himself to an early grave, trying to save every tenant and every rusty boat that limped into the yard." The casual dismissal in that familiar voice hit me like a physical blow. I thought about all the times I'd stayed late to help a customer who couldn't afford full price, all the payment plans I'd worked out with struggling fishermen. Dad had never complained about those decisions when he was alive. In fact, I'd thought he was proud of the way I ran the business. "So the plan is still on track?" Leah asked. "Everything's in motion. The loan documents will trigger the consolidation clause automatically. Brooks will have 30 days to come up with the full amount, or the properties go into foreclosure." "And there's no way he can raise that kind of money?" My father's laugh was bitter. "$250,000? From boat repairs and rental income? Not unless he's been hiding a treasure chest somewhere." $250,000. I tried to do the math in my head, thinking about our monthly income, our savings account, the equity in our properties. Even if I liquidated everything, I'd be lucky to come up with half that amount. "Evan's already lined up a management company for the transition," Leah said. "Very discreet. Brooks won't even have to deal with the details." "Good. The less he knows about the business side, the better. Let him think it's just bad luck and market forces." I closed my eyes, trying to reconcile the voice I was hearing with the man who'd raised me. My father had been gruff, demanding, sometimes impossible to please. But he'd also been honest to a fault, the kind of man who'd drive 50 miles to return a $20 overpayment from a customer. This voice, this plan, it wasn't the man I remembered. "I should go," Leah said. "He'll be expecting dinner soon, and I don't want him getting suspicious." "You've done good work, girl. Your daddy would be proud." Something cold settled in my stomach. Leah's father had passed away when she was in college, years before we met. She'd always been vague about her family, claiming they weren't close. I'd never pushed for details, respecting what I thought was painful history. "I miss him," Leah said softly. "I miss having someone who understood the big picture." "Well, you've got me now, and soon you'll have Evan. That boy's got vision. I'll give him that." "I love you, Dad." "Love you too, sweetheart. Now go make nice with that husband of yours. Just a little while longer." The call ended, leaving me alone with the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of Leah's car engine as she pulled into the garage. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the AirPods in my palm. 20 minutes. I'd been listening for 20 minutes, and my entire life had unraveled in that time. The garage door opened, and I heard Leah's heels clicking across the concrete. "Brooks, you out here?" I slipped the AirPods into my pocket and picked up the wrench, pretending to work on the outboard motor. "Just finishing up Mrs. Henderson's engine." Leah appeared in the doorway, looking perfectly normal. Same auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, same professional smile she wore when she wanted something. She was still wearing her work clothes, a navy blazer and matching skirt that probably cost more than most people in our town made in a week. "How was your day?" she asked, the question so routine and innocent that I almost wondered if I'd imagined the entire conversation. "Fine," I managed. "Yours?" "Oh, meetings and more meetings. I swear sometimes I think the corporate world runs on hot air and PowerPoint presentations." She moved closer, and I caught a whiff of her perfume, something expensive and floral that she'd started wearing recently. Another change I'd noticed but not questioned. "What's wrong?" she asked. "You look upset." I turned to face her, studying her expression. She looked genuinely concerned, her dark eyes soft with what appeared to be real affection. If I hadn't heard that conversation, I would have believed it completely. "Just tired," I said. "Long day. Well, come inside when you're ready. I picked up that Thai food you like from downtown." She turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and Brooks, I need you to sign a few more papers tonight, something about updating our insurance coverage." My grip tightened on the wrench. What kind of insurance? Nothing major, just some adjustments to the liability coverage on the rental properties. You know how complicated that stuff gets. I nodded, not trusting my voice. After she left, I sat alone in the garage for another hour, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank, or a misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew better. The details had been too specific, too coordinated. And that voice, even if someone was doing an impression of my father, how would they know about his mannerisms, his speech patterns, the way he'd always called me the boy when he was frustrated with me? I thought about the papers I'd signed over the past few months, the ones Leah had assured me were routine updates. How many of them had I actually read? How many times had I trusted my wife to handle the details while I focused on the day-to-day work of keeping the business running? As the sun set outside the garage windows, I made a decision. I was going to find out exactly what those papers said, and I was going to figure out who had been speaking with my father's voice. But first, I was going to eat Thai food and pretend that my world hadn't just collapsed around me. Because if Leah thought I was too trusting, too sentimental, too stupid to see what was happening under my nose, then maybe it was time to show her just how wrong she could be. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my father's voice discussing my future like I was a problem to be solved rather than his son. Leah slept peacefully beside me, her breathing steady and undisturbed, while I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out my next move. By morning, I had a plan. "I need to run some errands in town," I told Leah over breakfast. She was already dressed for work, scrolling through emails on her phone while she picked at a piece of toast. She murmured without looking up. "Don't forget about those insurance papers. I left them on your desk." "Right. The insurance papers." After she left, I went straight to my home office, a converted bedroom that served as the administrative hub for Carvin Marine. The papers were exactly where she'd said they'd be, neatly stacked and marked with yellow sticky notes indicating where I should sign. This time, I read every word. The documents were dense with legal language, but the basic structure became clear after an hour of careful reading. What Leah had described as insurance updates were actually loan consolidation agreements that would combine all of our existing debt, the house, the business, the rental properties, into a single massive loan with a variable interest rate. The kicker was buried on page 12. If we missed a single payment, or if the total debt exceeded 75% of the combined property value, the entire amount would become immediately due in full. I pulled out my calculator and started adding up numbers. Our current debt load was manageable, maybe $60,000 total across all properties. But according to these documents, we'd be taking on additional loans to optimize our cash flow and tax position. When I finished the math, the total came to just over $250,000, exactly the amount my father's voice had mentioned on that phone call. My hands were shaking as I set the papers aside. I needed more information, and I knew where to get it. Tina Kowalski had been the town clerk for 15 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birth certificate, every marriage license, every property transfer that crossed her desk. More importantly, she'd been friends with my mother back in high school, which meant she'd always had a soft spot for me. I found her at the town hall, surrounded by filing cabinets and looking harried as usual. The place always smelled like coffee and old paper, with fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to give you a headache if you stayed too long. "Brooks," she said, looking up from a stack of forms. "What brings you by? Please tell me it's not more paperwork from that wife of yours." I paused. "What do you mean?" Tina glanced around, then lowered her voice. "She's been in here a lot lately, asking about property records, tax assessments, that sort of thing. Very thorough, that one. Asked me about procedures I haven't used in years." "What kind of procedures?" "Oh, foreclosure processes, emergency transfers, how long property owners have to respond to various notices." She shrugged. I figured she was just trying to understand the business side of things. A lot of spouses get curious when they start thinking about retirement planning. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. "Tina, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Her expression grew serious. "What's going on, Brooks?" "My father's will. The original copy that's on file here. Can I see it?" "Of course, honey. It's public record." She disappeared into the back room, returning a few minutes later with a thick folder. "Here you go. Though I'm not sure why you'd need to see it again. Didn't your lawyer go over everything with you after the funeral?" I took the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. "I just want to make sure I understand all the details." The will was exactly as I remembered it from 3 years ago. Everything left to me, with Leah named as the alternate beneficiary if something happened to me. No conditions, no hidden clauses, no mention of any debts or obligations beyond the standard mortgage payments. "Tina," I said slowly, "has anyone else been asking about this will recently?" She frowned. "Well, Leah was curious about the property descriptions, wanted to make sure all the legal descriptions matched the current tax records. Very detail-oriented, like I said." "What about... Has anyone ever asked about updating or modifying the will? Maybe adding conditions or changing the terms?" "Brooks, you can't modify a will after someone passes. You know that, right? Once it's probated, it's final." I nodded, but my mind was racing. If the will couldn't be changed, then how was my father's voice talking about conditions and leverage requirements? "There is one thing," Tina said hesitantly. "About 6 months ago, a lawyer from Portland came by asking about your father's business records. Said he was representing an estate planning firm, doing some kind of audit." "What kind of audit?" He was very vague about it. Asked about any outstanding liens, any business partnerships, anything that might not have been included in the probate process. She lowered her voice again. "Between you and me, I thought it was odd. Most of that stuff would have been handled by your father's attorney. Did you give him anything?" "Just the public records. Same stuff anyone could request. But he seemed particularly interested in the rental properties on Maple Street." I thanked Tina and left the town hall with more questions than answers. If someone was claiming my father had hidden debts or secret business arrangements, they'd need documentation to back it up. And if they were planning to use that documentation to force me into selling the properties, I needed to talk to someone who'd known my father's business better than anyone. Grady Sullivan had worked at Carvin Marine for 12 years before retiring last spring. He was a few years older than me, a former Navy mechanic who could fix anything with an engine, and who'd been my father's right-hand man during the business's most successful years. These days, he spent his retirement working part-time as a bouncer at the Salted Knot, the local dive bar where half the town gathered to complain about the weather, and the other half gathered to complain about the first half. I found him there in the late afternoon, setting up for the evening crowd. The Salted Knot was exactly what you'd expect from a New England fishing town bar: dark wood, nautical decorations that had seen better decades, and the lingering smell of fried fish and spilled beer. "Brooks," Grady called out when he saw me. "Little early for you, isn't it?" "Not drinking," I said. "I need to ask you about something." Grady was a big man, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with graying hair and hands that were permanently stained with engine grease. He'd always been straight with me, even when it meant delivering news I didn't want to hear. "What's on your mind?" he asked, wiping down the bar with a rag that had seen better days. "Did my father ever mention any business debts? Anything that wasn't included in the will?" Grady's expression grew thoughtful. "Your dad was pretty careful about keeping the books clean." "Why?" I told him about the loan consolidation papers, about Leah's recent interest in property records, about the conversation I'd overheard. I left out the part about my father's voice that still seemed too crazy to say out loud. "250,000, Grady whistled. "That's serious money. The thing is, I can't figure out where it's coming from. Our actual debt is maybe 60,000, and that's including the mortgage. What about business loans? Equipment financing? I've been through all of that. Everything's current. Everything's documented." I paused. "Grady, did my father ever mention anyone named Evan Porter? The development guy?" "Yeah, your dad had some strong opinions about him." "What kind of opinions?" "Thought he was a snake. Porter came around a couple years ago, right before your dad got sick, making offers on the waterfront properties. Your dad told him where he could stick his offers." I felt a chill. "What kind of offers?" "Way above market value but with strings attached. Porter wanted to buy up the whole waterfront corridor, turn it into some kind of luxury marina. Your dad said it would destroy the character of the town, price out all the working families. So he turned him down?" "More than that. Your dad started organizing the other property owners, trying to get them to reject Porter's offers too. Said if they could keep the waterfront in local hands, they could control the development and make sure it benefited the community instead of just making some city boy rich." I thought about the phone conversation I'd overheard, about Evan being very patient with the development plans. "Did Porter give up after that?" "Seemed to. Haven't seen him around town in months. But you know how these developer types are. They don't give up easy when there's that much money involved." Grady finished wiping the bar and gave me a serious look. "Brooks, I don't know what's going on with those loan papers, but it smells fishy to me. Your dad was careful about debt, and he sure as heck wouldn't have set you up to lose everything he worked for." "That's what I thought too." "You want my advice? Get yourself a lawyer. A good one, not some local guy who's afraid to ruffle feathers. And don't sign anything else until you understand exactly what's going on." I thanked Grady and left the bar with my suspicions confirmed. Someone was trying to manipulate me into a financial situation that would force me to sell the properties. The question was how they planned to make it work and who was behind it. But first, I had a more immediate problem to solve. I needed to figure out who had been speaking with my father's voice. That evening, I sat in my home office with a legal pad and started making a list of everyone who'd known my father well enough to imitate his voice convincingly. It was a shorter list than I'd expected. My father had been a private man, friendly enough with customers and neighbors, but not the type to share personal details or let people get too close. His closest relationships had been with my mother, gone for 10 years now, with Grady, and with a handful of old-timers who'd fished these waters since they were teenagers. None of those men would have any reason to participate in a scheme to defraud me. More importantly, none of them had the kind of money or connections that would make them useful partners for someone like Evan Porter. I was still puzzling over the problem when Leah came home from work carrying takeout bags from the new fusion restaurant downtown. "Thought we'd try something different tonight," she said, unpacking containers of what looked like Asian-influenced seafood. "How was your day?" "Productive," I said. "Did those errands in town?" "Good. Did you get a chance to look at those insurance papers?" I watched her face carefully as I answered. "I read through them. Pretty complicated stuff." "That's why I handle the paperwork," she said with a smile. "I know how much you hate dealing with all the legal language. Actually, I had some questions about the consolidation terms." Her smile flickered for just a moment. "What kind of questions?" "Well, the total loan amount seems pretty high. I was wondering if we really need to borrow that much." Leah set down the container she'd been opening and gave me a patient look. Brooks, we've talked about this. The consolidation will lower our overall interest rate and give us better tax advantages. Yes, the total amount looks big, but that's because we're rolling everything together. Right, but what happens if property values drop, or if we have a bad year with the business? That's not going to happen. The waterfront properties are only going to increase in value, and the business has been steady for years. She sounded so confident, so reasonable. If I hadn't heard that phone conversation, I probably would have believed her completely. I think I'd like to have our lawyer review the documents before I sign, I said. This time, the flicker in her expression lasted longer. That's going to cost money we don't need to spend, Brooks. These are standard consolidation agreements. I've already had them reviewed by the firm that handles my company's legal work. I'd still feel better having our own lawyer take a look. Leah sighed. Fine. But don't blame me when he charges us $500 to tell us what I'm telling you for free. We ate dinner in relative silence after that, both of us pretending to watch the evening news while actually thinking about other things. I kept glancing at Leah, trying to reconcile the woman sitting across from me with the person I'd heard on that phone call. After dinner, she went upstairs to take a bath, and I returned to my office. The insurance papers were still on my desk, along with a pen and those helpful yellow sticky notes marking where I should sign. Instead of signing, I took photos of every page with my phone. Then I locked the documents in my desk drawer and went down to the basement. Our basement was unfinished, a concrete-walled space that I used for storage and for projects that were too messy for the garage. It was also where I kept my father's old business records, boxes of invoices, receipts, and correspondence that I'd never had the heart to throw away. I spent the next 2 hours going through those boxes, looking for anything that might explain the voice I'd heard. Business partnerships, loan agreements, anything that might have created the kind of obligations that mysterious voice had described. What I found instead was evidence of exactly the opposite. My father's records were meticulous. Every transaction was documented. Every debt was clearly noted and tracked through to payment. The picture that emerged was of a man who was almost obsessively careful about his financial obligations. More importantly, I found correspondence from the last year of his life that painted a very different picture of his relationship with Evan Porter. The letters started politely enough. Porter introducing himself, explaining his development plans, making initial offers for the waterfront properties. My father's responses were professional but firm, not interested in selling, committed to keeping the properties in local hands. But as the months went on, Porter's letters became more aggressive. He started mentioning market pressures and changing economic conditions that might force property owners to reconsider their positions. My father's responses grew correspondingly blunt. The last letter in the file was from my father to Porter, dated just 2 months before Dad went into the hospital. Mr. Porter, I've made my position clear multiple times. I am not interested in selling any of my properties to you or your investors, now or in the future. I would appreciate it if you would stop contacting me about this matter. Furthermore, I want you to know that I've advised the other waterfront property owners to be very cautious about any offers you might make. In my experience, deals that sound too good to be true usually are. Sincerely, William Carvin. I sat back on my heels, surrounded by boxes and papers, trying to piece together what I'd learned. My father had clearly been opposed to Porter's development plans. He'd been careful about debt and meticulous about documentation, and yet somehow, Porter was now positioned to buy the properties, with Leah's help and with the blessing of someone who sounded exactly like my father. It didn't make sense. Unless I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the contacts until I found the number for Riverside Memorial, the funeral home that had handled my father's arrangements. It was late, but I knew they had an answering service for emergencies. Riverside Memorial, this is Janet. Hi, this is Brooks Carvin. You handled my father's funeral about 3 years ago. William Carvin? Oh, yes, I remember. I'm so sorry for your loss. How can I help you? This might sound like an odd question, but I was wondering about your policies regarding recordings. What kind of recordings? Well, some families like to record the service, or maybe record the deceased person talking about their wishes beforehand. Do you help with that sort of thing? We do offer video services for families who want to record the ceremony, and we have had families bring us recordings of their loved ones to play during the service. Is there something specific you're looking for? Did anyone in my family leave any kind of recording with you? Maybe something that wasn't used during the service? There was a pause. Let me check our records. Can you hold for a moment? I waited, my heart pounding in the quiet basement. Mr. Carvin, I do show that your wife brought in a recording of your father about a week before the service. She said it was too personal to play publicly, but she wanted us to keep it on file in case the family changed their minds. Do you still have it? We keep those materials for 5 years unless the family requests their return. Would you like to pick it up? Yes, I said quickly. I'll be there tomorrow. After I hung up, I sat in the basement for a long time, staring at my father's neat handwriting on those old business letters. Whatever was on that recording, Leah had made sure it wasn't played at the funeral. She'd kept it hidden for 3 years, until she found a use for it. But what kind of recording could be twisted to support a plan my father had clearly opposed? I was about to find out. The next morning, I told Leah I had to make a parts run to Portland, a routine trip that wouldn't seem suspicious. Instead, I drove straight to Riverside Memorial. Janet turned out to be a kind woman in her 60s who remembered my father's funeral clearly. He was well loved in the community, she said, as she led me to a small office. We had to set up extra chairs. She handed me a manila envelope with my father's name written on it in Leah's precise handwriting. Your wife was very specific about keeping this private. She said it was too emotional for public viewing. Inside the envelope was a small digital recorder and a typed note. Dad's final thoughts about the family and the business, recorded during his last week in the hospital. L. I thanked Janet and drove to a quiet parking lot overlooking the harbor before I worked up the courage to press play. My father's voice filled the car, weaker than I remembered, but unmistakably him. Brooks, if you're listening to this, then I'm gone, and you're probably trying to figure out what to do with everything I've left you. I want you to know that I'm proud of the man you've become, and I trust you to make the right decisions about the business and the properties. I had to pause the recording. Hearing his voice again, even weakened by illness, brought back a flood of memories from those final weeks. The long hours at the hospital, the conversations about the future, the gradual acceptance that he wasn't going to recover. I pressed play again. The thing is, son, the world's changing faster than either of us expected. That Porter fellow has been sniffing around again, and I'm starting to think his development plans might not be as bad as I first thought. Maybe it's time for our family to think bigger, to be part of something that could really transform this town. I stopped the recording again, frowning. This didn't sound like the man who'd written those angry letters to Porter. My father had been many things, but he'd never been indecisive about his principles. The recording continued. I've been talking to some people, learning more about what Porter has in mind. It's not just about building fancy condos for rich folks. He wants to create jobs, bring in businesses that would give young people a reason to stay in town instead of moving away to find work. As I listened, my father's voice grew stronger, more enthusiastic. He talked about Porter's vision for sustainable development, about preserving the character of the town while modernizing its economy. He spoke about trust funds that would ensure local families could afford to stay in the area, about job training programs and small business incentives. It was a compelling vision, and it sounded like something my father might have supported. But it was also completely at odds with everything I'd found in his written correspondence. The thing is, Brooks, I know you've got your mother's soft heart. You'll want to keep everything exactly the way it's always been, even if that means watching the town slowly fade away. But sometimes you have to take risks to preserve what really matters. The recording went on for another 20 minutes, with my father laying out a detailed plan for gradually selling the properties to Porter's development company. He talked about timing, about market conditions, about the importance of making sure I understood the bigger picture before making any hasty decisions. If something happens to me before we can discuss this properly, I want you to know that I've made arrangements. There are some financial obligations that will help guide you toward the right choice. I know it might seem overwhelming at first, but trust the process. Trust Leah. She understands the business side better than either of us ever did. By the time the recording ended, I was sitting in stunned silence. If I hadn't seen my father's letters, if I hadn't heard that phone conversation, I might have believed every word. But I had seen the letters, and I knew my father well enough to recognize when something was wrong. The voice was definitely his, not an impersonation or a digital fake. But the words, the ideas, the complete reversal of his documented position. It was as if someone had taken pieces of different conversations and assembled them into a new narrative. I thought about the technology involved in something like that. Audio editing software, voice synthesis, the kind of sophisticated manipulation that would require both technical skill and access to a lot of source material. Someone would need hours of recordings of my father's voice, talking about business, about the town, about me. They'd need to understand his speech patterns well enough to create seamless transitions between different pieces of audio. And they'd need to know him well enough to craft a message that sounded psychologically plausible. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew who might be able to help me figure out how this had been done. "Uncle Brooks!" Jessie's voice was bright and energetic. At 17, my niece was the kind of kid who seemed to know everything about technology and nothing about why adults made things so complicated. "Hey, Jess, are you busy this afternoon?" "Just the usual. Homework, college applications, wondering why my parents think I need a curfew when I'm going away to school in 8 months. What's up?" "I need some help with a technical problem, audio editing stuff. Are you free to meet somewhere?" "Sure. Is this for the business? Are you finally going to start doing those promotional videos I suggested?" "Something like that. Can you meet me at the Marina office in an hour?" "Absolutely. This sounds way more interesting than my calculus homework." I spent the drive back to town thinking about what I was going to tell Jessie. She was smart, curious, and completely trustworthy, but she was also 17 years old. I didn't want to drag her into whatever mess I was uncovering. On the other hand, if someone had manipulated audio recordings to deceive me, I needed to understand how they'd done it. And Jessie knew more about digital technology than anyone else I trusted. I found her waiting at the Marina office, laptop bag slung over her shoulder, and an expression of barely contained excitement on her face. Jessie had inherited the family's dark hair and stubborn chin, but she'd gotten her mother's quick wit and her grandfather's mechanical aptitude. "So, what's this mysterious audio project?" she asked as I unlocked the office. I handed her the digital recorder. "I need you to analyze this recording. Tell me if it's been edited or manipulated in any way." She raised an eyebrow. "That's oddly specific. Is everything okay?" "I'm not sure yet. Can you do it?" "Of course. I've got software that can show audio waveforms, detect cuts and splices, even identify if different parts of a recording were made at different times or with different equipment." She plugged the recorder into her laptop and opened a program that displayed the audio as a complex waveform. For the next half hour, she worked in focused silence, occasionally pointing out technical details that I didn't understand. "Okay," she said finally. "This is definitely edited. See these breaks in the waveform? Those are places where different audio segments have been joined together, and the background noise changes several times throughout the recording, which suggests the original material came from multiple sources." "How many sources?" "Hard to say exactly, but I can identify at least 8 or 9 distinct segments. Some of them are pretty short, just a few words or phrases." I felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that my instincts had been right, anger that someone had gone to such elaborate lengths to deceive me. Could you tell where the original audio came from? Jessie shrugged. Not specifically, but based on the sound quality and the background noise patterns, I'd guess some of it came from phone conversations, some from video recordings, maybe some from voice messages. Whoever did this had access to a lot of source material. How difficult would this be to create? With the right software and enough source audio? Not that hard, actually. Time-consuming, but not technically challenging. The tricky part would be making the edits sound natural, especially the transitions between different segments. She paused, studying the waveform more closely. Uncle Brooks, this is really sophisticated work. Whoever did this spent a lot of time getting it right. This isn't some amateur prank. I thanked Jessie and asked her not to mention our conversation to anyone, especially her parents. She agreed, though I could see the curiosity burning in her eyes. After she left, I sat alone in the marina office, staring out at the harbor and trying to process what I'd learned. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating a fake recording of my father endorsing a plan he'd actually opposed. They'd used that recording to convince Leah, or to give Leah cover for a plan she was already part of. But who had access to enough recordings of my father's voice, and who had the technical skill to create such a convincing fake? I was beginning to suspect I knew the answer to at least one of those questions. It was time to have a more direct conversation with my wife. I waited until after dinner to bring up the insurance papers again. Leah was in the living room reading on her tablet when I sat down across from her with the documents in my hand. "I've been thinking about these consolidation agreements," I said. She looked up, her expression neutral. "And? I want to understand exactly how this is going to work. Walk me through the numbers." Leah set down her tablet and gave me her full attention. "What specifically do you want to know?" "Well, for starters, where does the $250,000 figure come from? I've added up all our current debt, and it's nowhere near that amount." "Brooks, we've been over this. The consolidation includes optimization loans that will improve our cash flow and tax position." "What kind of optimization loans?" She reached for a folder on the side table and pulled out a spreadsheet. Equipment financing for the marina, property improvement loans for the rental houses, working capital for seasonal fluctuations in the business. The spreadsheet was impressive, detailed, professional, full of projections and calculations that made the loans look not just reasonable but smart. If I hadn't known what I knew, I might have been convinced. "This equipment financing," I said, pointing to a line item. "What equipment are we buying? New boat lifts? Updated electrical systems? A proper customer service building instead of that old trailer you're using as an office? And these property improvements? Renovations to bring the rental houses up to modern standards, new kitchens, updated bathrooms, energy-efficient heating systems, the kind of improvements that will justify higher rents and increase property values." It all sounded reasonable, more than reasonable. It sounded like exactly the kind of long-term thinking that would secure our financial future. "The thing is," I said carefully, "I'm not sure we need all of these improvements right now. The business is doing fine, and the rental houses are in decent shape." Leah's expression grew patient, the way it did when she thought I was being unnecessarily stubborn. "Brooks, you can't just maintain the status quo forever. If we don't invest in improvements, our competitors will pass us by." "What competitors? We're the only full-service marina in town." "For now, but that could change quickly if someone decides to build a modern facility." I thought about Evan Porter's development plans, about luxury marinas and upscale clientele. Has someone talked about building a competing marina? Not specifically, but it's always a possibility. That's why we need to stay ahead of the curve. I studied her face, looking for any sign that she was thinking about specific plans or specific competitors. But her expression remained perfectly reasonable, perfectly concerned about our shared future. "Leah," I said, "I found something interesting today." "What's that?" I pulled out my phone and played a few seconds of the recording, just enough to let her hear my father's voice talking about trusting her business judgment. Her reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible pause before she responded. "Where did you get that?" "The funeral home. Apparently you left it with them 3 years ago." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I wasn't sure if you were ready to hear it back then. You were still grieving." "But I'm ready now?" "I thought it might help you understand why these financial decisions are important. Your father was a smart man, Brooks. He understood that sometimes you have to take calculated risks." I played a few more seconds of the recording, the part where my father talked about Porter's development plans. "He certainly seemed to have strong opinions about the town's future," I said. Leah nodded. "He did. He spent a lot of time thinking about these issues during his final weeks." "That's interesting, because I also found some letters he wrote to Evan Porter. They painted a very different picture of his opinions." This time, her reaction was more obvious. She set down the tablet and gave me a sharp look. "What letters?" "Business correspondence. Dad kept copies of everything." I pulled out photocopies of the letters I'd found. "These don't sound like a man who was enthusiastic about Porter's development plans." Leah took the letters and read through them quickly. "People change their minds, Brooks, especially when they're facing their own mortality. Your father had time to reconsider his initial reaction." "Maybe. Or maybe someone helped him reconsider." "What's that supposed to mean?" I leaned forward. "It means I think that recording has been edited. Pieces of different conversations, assembled to create a message my father never actually intended." Leah stared at me for a long moment. "That's a very serious accusation." "It's a very serious situation. Brooks, I understand that this is overwhelming. These financial decisions are complicated, and I know you prefer to focus on the hands-on work rather than the business planning. But accusing me of... What? Fraud? That's not fair." Her voice had taken on a hurt tone, the kind of emotional appeal that had always been effective in past arguments. But this time, I wasn't backing down. "I'm not accusing you of anything yet. I'm just trying to understand what's really going on. What's going on is that I'm trying to secure our financial future, and you're letting paranoia and grief cloud your judgment." She stood up, gathering the papers and her tablet. "I think you need to decide whether you trust me or not, Brooks, because if you don't, then we have bigger problems than loan consolidation." After she went upstairs, I sat alone in the living room, thinking about trust and evidence and the difference between the two. Leah was right about one thing. If I couldn't trust my wife, then we did have bigger problems, but trust had to be based on truth. And I was becoming increasingly certain that someone wasn't telling me the truth. I spent the next hour going through the loan documents again, this time with a calculator and a clearer understanding of what I was looking for. The numbers were complex, but the basic structure was simple. Take on a large amount of debt secured by all of our properties, then hope that everything went according to plan. If it worked, we'd end up with improved properties and a more efficient business. If it didn't work, if we missed payments, if property values dropped, if the business had a bad year, we'd lose everything. It was exactly the kind of high-risk, high-reward strategy that my father had always avoided. I was still working through the calculations when my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We should talk. Meet me at the old lumberyard tomorrow at noon. Come alone. A friend." I stared at the message for a long time, wondering who might want to meet in secret and what they might want to discuss. The old lumberyard had been closed for years, a collection of abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town that teenagers used for parties and adults used for activities they didn't want neighbors to witness. It could be a trap. It could be someone trying to scare me away from asking inconvenient questions. Or it could be someone with answers. I decided I was going to find out. The old lumber yard looked even more desolate in the gray November light. I parked behind the main building and walked through the maze of abandoned equipment and overgrown weeds, wondering if I was making a mistake. I found him waiting in what used to be the main office, a man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of expensive casual clothes that marked him as someone from away. He was sitting on a stack of old lumber, smoking a cigarette, and looking like he'd been there for a while. Brooks Carvin, I presume. Depends who's asking. He smiled and stood up, extending his hand. Evan Porter. I think it's time we had a proper conversation. I didn't take his hand. About what? About your wife's plans for your properties. About that recording she's been using to convince you your father changed his mind. About what's really going to happen if you sign those loan documents. Porter was smaller than I'd expected, with the kind of soft build that suggested more time in boardrooms than outdoors. But his eyes were sharp, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. Why would you want to tell me anything? I asked. Because Leah has been making promises she can't keep, and I don't like being played for a fool. He took another drag on his cigarette and gestured for me to sit on another stack of lumber. Your wife approached me 6 months ago with a proposition. She said she could deliver your properties for development, but she needed time to set up the financial pressure that would force you to sell. The loan consolidation. Exactly. Create enough debt to make the properties unsustainable, then swoop in with a generous buyout offer, very clean, very legal, and very profitable for everyone involved. Except me. Porter shrugged. You'd get fair market value for the properties plus enough to pay off the consolidated loans. You wouldn't be rich, but you wouldn't be ruined either. How generous. The thing is, Leah got greedy. The original plan was to offer you 75% of the appraised value, enough to cover your debts and give you a fresh start somewhere else. But she's been pushing for a lower offer, claiming you'd be desperate enough to take 50%. I felt a cold anger building in my chest. And you're telling me this because you're concerned about my welfare? I'm telling you this because I don't trust partners who change the terms after we've shaken hands. If Leah is willing to cheat you, she's probably willing to cheat me too. Porter finished his cigarette and ground it out under his heel. Besides, I've been doing some research on your family's history in this town. Your father was respected here. People remember him as honest, hard-working, someone who kept his word. I'd rather do business with someone who has that kind of reputation. What kind of business? A legitimate partnership. You keep ownership of the marina and the rental properties, but you lease the development rights to my company. We build the luxury condos and the upscale restaurant. You provide the marine services and the local knowledge. Everybody wins. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. What's the catch? No catch. Just a different approach to the same development project. Instead of buying you out and dealing with community opposition, we make you a partner and get community support. Porter pulled a business card from his wallet. Think about it, Brooks, but don't think too long. Leah's timeline is accelerating, and once you sign those loan documents, your options become much more limited. After he left, I sat alone in the abandoned office, trying to process what I'd learned. If Porter was telling the truth, then Leah had been planning this deception for months. The recording, the loan documents, the fake insurance updates, all part of an elaborate scheme to force me into a position where I'd have to sell the properties. But could I trust Porter? He had his own agenda, his own reasons for wanting to undermine Leah's plan. And his offer of partnership might be just another form of manipulation, designed to make me feel like I had choices when I really didn't. I needed more information before I made any decisions. That evening, I told Leah I was going to spend some time at the marina catching up on paperwork. Instead, I drove to Jessie's house. I found her in the garage, working on an old motorcycle that she'd been restoring as a senior project. She was covered in grease and completely absorbed in whatever mechanical problem she was solving. Uncle Brooks, what brings you by? Please tell me you have more mysterious audio files to analyze. Actually, I need a different kind of help. Computer research. She wiped her hands on a rag and gave me her full attention. What kind of research? I need to know everything you can find about Evan Porter's development company. Financial records, previous projects, business partners, anything that might tell me whether he's legitimate or just another con artist. Jessie grinned. Now that sounds like a proper investigation. Give me an hour. While she worked, I sat in the garage and thought about the choices I was facing. I could confront Leah directly, demand that she explain the recording and the loan documents. But if she was really part of a scheme to defraud me, confronting her would just give her time to cover her tracks or accelerate her timeline. I could sign the loan documents and hope for the best. But everything I'd learned suggested that was exactly what Leah wanted me to do, and that it would end with me losing everything my father had worked to build. Or I could try to turn the tables, use what I knew to create my own plan. Okay, Jessie said, looking up from her laptop. Evan Porter is interesting. Good interesting or bad interesting? Both. His development company is legitimate. They've completed several successful projects in coastal Maine over the past 5 years. High-end residential developments mostly with a focus on sustainable design and community integration. That sounds good. It is good. The projects are well regarded, the financing is solid, and the local communities seem happy with the results. But here's the interesting part. Porter's company has a history of working with local partners rather than buying properties outright. She showed me her laptop screen, which displayed several news articles about Porter's previous developments. In every case, he's structured deals where the original property owners retain ownership while leasing development rights to his company. It's actually a pretty innovative approach. So his offer to me might be legitimate? Based on his track record, yes, but there's something else you should know. Jessie pulled up another screen, this one showing corporate filings and financial records. Porter's company has been having cash flow problems for the past year. They're not in danger of bankruptcy, but they're definitely under pressure to complete their current projects and start generating revenue from new ones. Which means he might be more motivated to make a deal than he's letting on. If your wife has been stringing him along for 6 months, he's probably getting desperate to move forward. I thought about Porter's willingness to meet with me, his eagerness to undermine Leah's plan. Maybe it wasn't just about not trusting partners who changed the terms. Maybe he needed this deal more than he'd admitted. There's one more thing, Jessie said. I found some interesting connections between Porter's company and a consulting firm in Portland. Guess who works for that consulting firm? She didn't wait for me to guess. Your wife's company has been using them for business development consulting for the past year. It's possible that's how she and Porter first connected. I felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Leah hadn't been approached by Porter with a scheme to defraud me. She'd approached him with a scheme to defraud me, using her professional connections to set up the partnership. Uncle Brooks, Jessie said quietly, what are you going to do? I'm going to give them exactly what they want, I said, with a few modifications they won't see coming. It was time to stop being the victim in this story and start being the author. I spent that night planning my response, and by morning I knew exactly what I was going to do. First, I called the bank that was supposed to process the loan consolidation and told them I needed to postpone the paperwork for a few days while my lawyer reviewed the terms. The loan officer was accommodating. Apparently, last-minute reviews were common with large financial transactions. Next, I called Porter and told him I was interested in discussing his partnership proposal, but I needed a few days to consider my options. He agreed to meet again later in the week. Then I went home and told Leah I was ready to sign the insurance papers. I've been thinking about what you said, I told her over breakfast, about taking calculated risks and trusting your business judgment. You're right. I can't just maintain the status quo forever. Her relief was obvious, though she tried to hide it behind professional composure. I'm glad you've come around. These changes will be good for us, Brooks. You'll see. I'm sure they will be, but before I sign anything, I want to make sure I understand the timeline. When do the loans go into effect? The consolidation should be complete within 2 weeks. Then we can start implementing the improvement plans. And the first payment would be due when? 90 days after closing. That gives us time to get the initial improvement started before we have to worry about the increased monthly payments. 90 days. That was useful information. What about the rental properties? Will we need to give the tenants notice about the renovations? I've already started that process. Most of the leases expire at the end of the year anyway, so the timing works out perfectly. I nodded as if this all made perfect sense, as if I hadn't noticed that she'd been planning these changes long before she'd discussed them with me. That afternoon, I drove to Portland and met with a lawyer that Grady had recommended, someone who specialized in business fraud and had a reputation for being both thorough and discreet. His name was Richard Chen, and his office was in a converted warehouse overlooking the harbor. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he didn't waste time on small talk. "Mr. Carvin," he said after I'd explained the situation, "what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated scheme to defraud you of your properties. The question is whether we can prove it and what you want to do about it. I want to stop it, and I want to make sure they don't try something like this again. The edited recording is good evidence of deception, but it's not necessarily proof of criminal fraud. Your wife could claim she was trying to help you understand your father's wishes, even if she used poor judgment in how she presented the information. What about the loan consolidation, the fake insurance papers? Those are more serious. If she's misrepresented the nature of the documents or their consequences, that could constitute fraud. But again, she could claim she was acting in what she believed were your best interests." Chen leaned back in his chair. "The strongest evidence would be proof of coordination with Porter, communications showing that they planned this scheme together, or documentation of the financial arrangements they've made. How would I get that kind of proof? Legally? You'd need access to her communications, her financial records, evidence of meetings or payments. The problem is that most of that information is probably protected by privacy laws or spousal privilege. What if she gave me access voluntarily?" Chen raised an eyebrow. "That would be different. If you had legitimate access to her communications and discovered evidence of fraud, that could be used in legal proceedings. And if I wanted to turn the tables on them? Use their own plan against them? That would be more complicated. Any response would have to be carefully planned to avoid crossing legal boundaries. But if someone is trying to defraud you, you do have the right to protect yourself." I left Chen's office with a clearer understanding of my legal options and a plan for gathering the evidence I needed. But first, I had to get Leah to trust me enough to give me access to her communications. That evening, I approached her with what I hoped sounded like genuine enthusiasm for our financial future. "I've been thinking about those improvement projects," I said. "The new marina facilities, the rental house renovations. I'd like to be more involved in the planning process." Leah looked up from her laptop, surprised. "Really? I thought you preferred to focus on the day-to-day operations." "I did. But this is too important to leave entirely to others. These changes are going to affect everything we've built together." "What kind of involvement did you have in mind?" "Well, for starters, I'd like to see the communications with the contractors, the architects, the project managers. I want to understand the timeline and make sure we're coordinating everything properly." "Of course. Most of that information is on my laptop and phone. I can show you the files tomorrow. Actually, would it be easier if you just gave me access to your accounts? That way I can review everything at my own pace without taking up your time." She hesitated for just a moment. "I suppose that makes sense. The passwords are all saved in my browser anyway." The next morning, while Leah was at work, I spent 3 hours going through her email accounts, her text messages, and her cloud storage files. What I found exceeded my worst expectations. The communications with Porter went back 8 months, starting with Leah's initial inquiry about development opportunities and evolving into a detailed plan to manipulate me into selling the properties. They'd discussed the edited recording, the loan consolidation, even the specific timing of when to approach me with various pieces of the plan. But the most damaging evidence was a series of emails between Leah and a voice actor in Boston, someone she'd hired to help create additional audio content using my father's voice. The actor had been provided with hours of source material, family videos, phone conversations, even recordings Leah had made during my father's final weeks in the hospital. The fake recording wasn't just edited, it was partially fabricated, with an actor filling in gaps where my father's actual words didn't support the narrative Leah wanted to create. I printed everything and drove straight to Chen's office. "This is more than enough," he said after reviewing the evidence. "This is conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, possibly elder abuse if she recorded your father without his knowledge. We could pursue criminal charges." "What about the civil side? Can I recover damages?" "Absolutely. And given the sophistication of the scheme, we could probably argue for punitive damages as well." I thought about Leah, about the woman I'd been married to for 15 years, about the life we'd built together that was apparently all based on lies. What if I wanted to give them a chance to back down gracefully, make it clear that I know what they're planning, but offer them a way out that doesn't involve criminal charges? Chen studied me carefully. "That's generous, considering what they've done to you. But it's your choice. What did you have in mind?" "I want to set up a meeting. All 3 of us, me, Leah, and Porter. I'll present the evidence and give them a choice. Walk away now or face the legal consequences. And if they choose to walk away, then they walk away. Leah and I will have to figure out what happens to our marriage, but at least I'll keep the properties and the business. And if they don't?" I thought about my father's voice on that recording, about the months of deception, about the casual way they'd discussed destroying everything he'd worked to build. "Then we make sure everyone in town knows exactly what kind of people they really are." Chen nodded slowly. "I can arrange that kind of meeting, but I want to be there as your legal representation, and I want everything recorded." "Fair enough. Set it up for tomorrow evening. And Chen, make sure they know this isn't a negotiation. It's a final offer." That night, I sat in my workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that represented everything I loved about my life in this town. Tomorrow I'd find out whether I got to keep any of it, but at least I'd find out on my own terms. The sound of betrayal had been loud enough to wake me up. Now it was time to make sure everyone else could hear it too.